mind for each and every character arc, subplot, and narrative arc, the book ended up being less cogent and cohesive as a whole. There was something of a disconnect between the beginning and end. Because I did not have the end in mind when I started. This would lead to unnecessary side quests, character threads that were dropped when I found something more compelling, and points of tension that were more cheaply resolved than a good story demands. On revision, an author can go back and tighten all this up, but because these elements of the setup are inherently woven into the structure of the story, it is difficult to edit a story to the point where it feels like there was no disconnect in the first place. It is difficult to make it feel like these story beats you think of later were always considered from the beginning. In the culmination of my incompetence, I implemented a scorched earth policy in mid-2018 regarding the fantasy book I had been writing, rewriting, editing, and re-editing for a decade. It was dead to me, but it had been dead long before then. Not every author who uses the gardener method is going to face these problems, and that is totally okay. If it works for you, then use it. It is easy to understand why it is an attractive planning method. It doesn't require you to figure out everything ahead of time, and you can get right down to writing, which is the fun bit. Sometimes the idea of planning in detail is daunting. It feels like a commitment to a story you have only just begun to unravel, its secrets only just beginning to be uncovered. Planning specifically and intentionally beforehand does not so easily allow you the flexibility to change and evolve as time goes on, which is critical for inexperienced writers or writers who aren't quite sure what they want to write. The decisive might get results, but that doesn't make them good results. The backwards planning method. My method is somewhere in between the architect and gardener models, and it can be divided into 3 steps. 1. The climactic scene. 2. The core scenes. 3. 3-act structuring. The climactic scene. Any mildly good story I have written, 53, is built around a single scene I have fallen in love with. Every author imagines being able to finally write the critical moments in their story, when the mystery is revealed, when X comes back from the dead, when Y is killed in an emotional crescendo. Not every or any scene will do for this climactic scene, though. For structural reasons, I look for the following 3 elements before proceeding. 1. It must resolve a thread of tension in the 3rd act climax of the book. 2. It must involve the resolution of a character arc. 3. It must take place in a particular setting. My stories tend to revolve around themes or struggles that I want to explore personally, feelings of responsibility for mentally ill friends, the meaning of suffering, whether the question of God's existence matters in deciding whether to believe, what it means to become an adult, keeping mental illness secret from other mentally ill friends for fear of becoming a burden, whether sex and love should be connected. These are complex, fascinating, and draining themes that I have explored in my writing at various points, and the conflicts in each novel have revolved around these sorts of questions. As mentioned, planning in detail can feel like a commitment to a story before you're ready. I attempt to circumvent this problem by writing stories that revolve around questions I care about so passionately. Because these are things I struggle with in my own life, I do not tend to change what this climactic scene deals with much. These questions are so woven into the heart of the story that changing this climactic scene would be like writing a different book. 54. For this scene to be the cornerstone of my novel, it needs to fully formed. Without these 3 elements, it is not that useful to me in structuring the rest of my story, and is clearly not a strong enough scene by itself. My big secret is that I only very occasionally get ideas for books, and this is largely because I dismiss any vague idea I might have for a story if I cannot find any character arcs, setting, or narrative structure to wrap it in. These are just 3 features that I find particularly pertinent. Others could legitimately substitute setting for fully articulating a major theme, like in C.S. Lewis's works, or a major story beat in a relationship between 2 characters, as would be more common in a romance novel. Which elements I would look for in a scene before proceeding do change depending on the genre, and my mindset going in, but I generally try to have these 3 there at the beginning. It needs to resolve a point of tension at the climax, resolve an arc, and have a particular setting for one simple reason: if I do not know where I am going with the story, like a blind man walking through an old forest, I cannot see what lies ahead, and I will trip and fall on every route. It needs to resolve climactic tension, because this tells me one part of what I should be building tension towards from the beginning of the story. It needs to resolve a character arc, because character arcs are the sinew of a story, telling me what a character should be changing towards psychologically from the beginning of the story. It needs a clear setting to tell me where my characters need to somehow end up physically through the events of the plot. It is all about creating a framework wherein I am always writing towards something. In one story I wrote throughout 2015, I imagined a scene where one character finally accepts that not everything is his responsibility and fault. This revelation happened as a girl resolved a point of tension in her relationship with another, and it took place at a lighthouse. With this basic climactic scene in mind, I then try to give it depth. This means working out exactly where it takes place. It was not simply a lighthouse, but it was Leuchtturm Dornbusch on the northern German coastline, and at the time was around 7 p.m. on the 21st of July 2015. It means figuring out who is in the scene. It was not just the protagonist, who would resolve their character arc, but a female counterpart who would act as a foil in exploration of this idea, her mother, and the protagonist's brother whom he had been traveling Europe with. It means figuring out exactly what happens. The protagonist and the female foil say farewell after a tense confrontation between her and her mother. To be clear, deciphering the climactic scene in this method is not the same as figuring out everything that happens at the climax. However, the more I can decipher in this crucial scene that the story builds toward, the better it acts as my guiding light while I write. At a minimum, I decipher the character arcs of all of the main characters. At this point in the planning process, it is not necessary for me to know fully how the story gets to this point. Stories are satisfying because on the most basic level they set up questions and give satisfying answers. This method aims to ensure that the story always feels like it is heading towards this payoff or answer, that it reads as a cohesive whole because the beginning and middle were written with the end in mind. One of the reasons Snyder's Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice failed was that it focused on moments rather than scenes. 55 of these are snapshots of the story, often in the form of one-liners or gorgeous stills of imagery that look and sound amazing but do not have any depth to them. They do not resolve character arcs, culminate with major relationship beats, or inherently resolve tension in a meaningful way. The story strings from moment to moment rather than from scene to scene, and the story suffers for it. I am not sure there was any core scene that was fully developed before the script started. If there was, it was not clearly enough thought through, and the narrative does not build towards it in a satisfying way. The core scenes. With the climactic scene in play, I know what I am writing towards. With a nuanced understanding of whereabouts the story needs to end up, I can work backwards to decipher the scenes that need to take place in order for the story to logically and satisfactorily arrive at that climactic scene. These needed scenes are called the core scenes. My method works backwards from the climactic scene in the abstract first, with a particular focus on the character arc as the sinew of the story. 1. Determine a few major points of psychological change needed for the character to naturally conclude their arc in the climactic scene. 2. Determine a few major plot events required for the climactic scene to take place at the climax. 3. Determine the major changes in setting required to reach the setting of the climactic scene. This includes determining the state the character is in at the beginning, both psychologically and physically. The best way to demonstrate this is with an example. In Avatar, The Last Airbender, Prince Zuko has a climactic scene in The Day of Black Sun Part 2, the eclipse where he turns against his father at last, finally accepting that he was abused, that being banished was not his fault, and that he has honor regardless of what his father thinks. The writers knew this was where they wanted him to be at the end of the story. Working backwards, this climactic scene requires 1. Psychological changes. Zuko begins to realize that true fulfillment will not come with him taking down the Avatar, that his ultimate loyalty is not to the Fire Nation, that he is worthy of love, and that he has to decide his own destiny. 2. Plot events. Aang needs to be defeated for Zuko to return home, Iroh needs to love him and challenge him on deciding his own destiny, and he needs to be betrayed by his own country. 3. Setting changes. Zuko needs to be in the Fire Nation during the eclipse. The writers knew that for the climactic scene to mean something, we have to see that Zuko believes none of these things at the beginning. This is his psychological state. He also needs to be pursuing Aang, the Avatar, throughout the world. This is his physical state. Determining this establishes a connection between the beginning and ending of the story. A few major points of psychological change and few major plot events such as these comprise the core scenes of my story. These are the major story beats that contribute towards the climactic scene I have fallen in love with. There are not usually more than 4 of these, and no fewer than 2 in my plan. If I do not have at least 2 powerful moments of development, then I have not understood the climactic scene on a deep enough level. If there are more than 4, then their impact begins to dilute. Most importantly, I nail down how the major 2 to 4 plot events interact with the major 2 to 4 psychological changes. I pair a major plot event with a major psychological shift. This gives me 2 to 4 detailed core scenes with both a plot and psychological dimension to explore. The reasons for this will be addressed below. The core scenes process can be done in infinitely more detail depending on what you know of your climactic scene, and want to work backwards from. I personally focus on the major changes as the guiding elements of my story, because they create the bulk of the experience for the reader, and I prioritize development in the character arc, and the choices involved in it, because my stories typically derive most of their tension from there. Anyone else using this formula could legitimately prioritize other elements of their writing, especially if the tension is derived from other aspects. With my climactic scene, and my 2 to 4 core scenes laid down, I begin to order and structure these into a cohesive narrative. 3-act structuring. The 3-act structure has stood the test of time because it facilitates good storytelling. Flexibility is also important when writing, so I choose not to follow it to the letter, but it does help structure the core scenes. Theorists have offered a million different formulations and interpretations of the 3-act structure, 56, but they all have the following story beats in common. 1. The inciting incident, the event that triggers the events of the plot. 2. The first act climax, the first major obstacle as the protagonist enters a new setting, physical or metaphorical. 3. The crisis, the protagonist is at their lowest point. 4. The second act climax, the second major obstacle, and a scene that often ends in failure. 5. The third act climax, the major points of tension in the story are resolved. The climactic scene takes place roughly at this point. 6. The denouement, the protagonist enters a new norm. These points collectively comprise only a basic 3-act structure, but they serve in structuring the core scenes I identified in my second step. Generally speaking, if a major plot event or psychological change does not fit into one of the slots of the 3-act structure, then I tend to return to step 2 and consider the climactic scene more deeply to find a core scene that does. Though it may not be purposeful, we can see how core scenes fit into the 3-act structure in other media. To return to our Avatar example. 1. The inciting incident, Zuko spots the pillar of light that signals the Avatar's return in The Boy in the Iceberg. 2. The first act climax, during the Siege of the North, when Zuko is hunted by Admiral Zhao and is saved by Aang, Zuko questions his loyalty to the Fire Nation, and whether his enemies are bad. He has been betrayed by his people. 3. The crisis, this takes place across the episodes Lake Laogai up to Crossroads of Destiny. The crisis is epitomized in this interaction between Zuko and Iroh. Iroh, I was just about to ask you the same thing. What do you plan to do now that you've found the Avatar's bison? Keep him locked in our new apartment. Should I go put on a pot of tea for him? Zuko, first I have to get it out of here. Iroh, and then what? You never think these things through. Points at him. This is exactly what happened when you captured the Avatar at the North Pole. You had him, and then you had nowhere to go. Zuko, I would have figured something out. Iroh, no. If his friends hadn't found you, you would have frozen to death. Zuko, I know my own destiny, uncle. Iroh, is it your own destiny, or is it a destiny someone else has tried to force on you? Zuko, stop it, uncle. I have to do this. Iroh, I'm begging you, Prince Zuko. It's time for you to look inward and begin asking yourself the big questions. Who are you and what do you want? Zuko struggles internally over who decides what his destiny should be and whether he deserves to be loved. His uncle shows him unending forgiveness, something his father never did. 4. The second act climax. In Crossroads of Destiny, at the end of the second season, Zuko has to decide whether he still believes in the destiny imposed on him by his father, and whose side he is on. This is his lowest point, as it culminates in Zuko failing to decide his own destiny and accept love. He sides against the Avatar once more, and Aang is supposedly killed. In the aftermath of Crossroads of Destiny, Zuko returns to the Fire Nation a victor, and has his honor back. However, he does not find this fulfilling. In the episode The Beach, he says, Zuko, for so long I thought that if my dad accepted me, I'd be happy. I'm back home now, my dad talks to me. Huh? He even thinks I'm a hero. Everything should be perfect, right? I should be happy now, but I'm not. I'm angrier than ever, and I don't know why. I'm angry at myself. 5. The third act climax. Zuko begins to realize that gaining the approval of his abuser will not bring him fulfillment. That to be happy and fulfilled, he needs to decide his own destiny. He does this in his climactic scene in The Day of Black Sun Part 2, The Eclipse. Zuko, for so long, all I wanted was for you to love me, to accept me. I thought it was my honor I wanted, but really, I was just trying to please you. You, my father, who banished me just for talking out of turn. Points a broadsword at his father. My father, who challenged me, a 13-year-old boy, to an Agni Kai. How could you possibly justify a duel with a child? And it was cruel. It was wrong. But I've come to an even more important decision. I'm going to join the Avatar, and I'm going to help him defeat you. 6. The denouement. Zuko enters a new norm as a reformed man in the episodes following. Working backwards allows you to tie every major plot point to a satisfying resolution of the tension in the story. As we can see in Zuko's story, the major psychological changes and the major plot points tend to align with the climaxes of the first, second, and third acts. Changes in setting can take place at any point in the story. When I plan my novel, I align my core scenes with the first, second, and third act climaxes, as well as the crisis point. Combining major character arc moments and plot points makes them more poignant, and helps the story flow naturally. There is an intimate connection between how the character develops mentally and their experiences. If I did not connect them, then I would wonder what the purpose of this plot event is, given that it does not majorly contribute to the development of my characters as people. This structure just helps me know that setting changes need to happen at some point while I am writing, and I naturally find myself angling the direction of my story to ensure it meets these marks. This method can be repeated for parallel stories or other characters' emotional arcs. It is not uncommon for numerous characters to have their own climactic scenes in a story, and that collectively their scenes, along with other characters, make up the third act climax. By the end of the third step, I have a climactic scene that resolves a major character arc, and a large part of the tension in my story, and I have the constituent scenes that lay a firm foundation for this scene laid down in a formula that follows the three-act structure. This means that everything written down is intimately connected in hopes of constructing the most satisfying ending to the story. While these 3 steps may seem more up an architect's alley, it is at this point that my inner gardener takes over. I know where my story begins, where it ends, and the core scenes that link those 2 points in between. As long as I keep these crucial points of development in mind when writing, the book is allowed to evolve organically. The problem a lot of gardeners face is not that their writing is bad, but that it lacks direction. Part of the problem that ardent architects face is that planning too heavily can be restrictive, with the narrative feeling forced because they need to follow it for coherence, even though a change might actually work better. To put it simply, 1. The climactic scene detail a third act scene that is the culmination of dramatic and emotional threads throughout the story. 2. The core scenes determine 2 to 4 major plot points and 2 to 4 psychological changes required to make that climactic scene happen. 3. 3-act structuring order and structure these core scenes into the first, second, and third act climaxes, and the crisis point. This planning method gives me the direction I need to form a cohesive narrative with a strong sense of cause to effect, and it has the flexibility to mean plans do not become too restrictive.